Powerful millionaire's heart shattered by a poor girl selling water. You won't believe what happened. Welcome to StoriesTH, where we bring you heartwarming stories of genuine love that inspire and touch the soul. In today's story, we explore the transformative power of love that transcends all barriers. If you enjoy these kinds of emotional stories, please don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more touching content. Let's dive right in. The unlikely connection. Dylan and Sophia's story. Dylan Mitchell, a successful millionaire, had always lived in a world defined by wealth, power, and social status. His life had been carefully curated by a series of decisions designed to ensure his dominance in the business world. But on one seemingly ordinary day in New York, something caught his attention that would alter the course of his life forever. It wasn't a business deal, a meeting with potential partners, or even an opportunity to further his empire. No, what captured Dylan's attention that day was a young girl standing on the sidewalk, selling bottles of water. Sophia Carter, dressed in a worn-out t-shirt and faded jeans, called out to passers-by, offering ice-cold, refreshing water for just $2. Her voice echoed through the busy streets of the city, but it wasn't just her words that stood out to Dylan. It was her energy, her posture, the way she stood tall despite the weight of her circumstances. She didn't look like someone who was struggling. She looked like someone who had mastered the art of survival and independence. She wasn't merely selling water. She was commanding attention, asserting her presence on a street where most people might have faded into the background. Dylan, always someone used to being in control and accustomed to the best, wasn't sure what it was about her that drew him in. Perhaps it was the fire in her eyes when a man tried to cheat her on the price of the water, or perhaps it was the way she didn't back down, even in the face of conflict. He watched as Sophia calmly handled the situation, not allowing the man to get away with his attempt to rip her off. When he complained that the water was overpriced, she snapped back with a confidence that was rare in the people he usually encountered in his world of high society. "Rip you off?" she had said, her voice strong and unshaken. "I walked up and down this street 3 times carrying this cooler in the heat. If you think it's overpriced, go buy it somewhere else." Dylan was intrigued. The way she stood her ground, the way she held on to her dignity, even in a moment of confrontation, fascinated him. He had seen countless people give in to the pressures of the world: cowards, sycophants, those willing to bend or break just to survive. But Sophia wasn't like that. She didn't just survive, she thrived. And she did it on her own terms. Before Dylan could even think further, he found himself walking toward her. She looked up, surprised to see a man in a flawless suit approaching her on the busy sidewalk. He seemed completely out of place, a stark contrast to the gritty reality of the street corner. The sun was beating down, and the heat seemed unbearable, but Dylan didn't seem to mind. He wasn't here for business, wasn't here to make a deal or further his financial interests. He was just curious. "How many bottles do you have left?" Dylan asked, breaking the silence. Sophia narrowed her eyes, unsure of what he wanted. "Why? I want to buy them all," Dylan replied, his tone casual, yet determined. Sophia blinked in surprise. "All of them? What's the deal with that?" Without hesitation, Dylan pulled out a $100 bill and tossed it onto the table. "Let me know if you need change," he said, his voice confident, as though this were just another transaction. Sophia crossed her arms and eyed him suspiciously. "Trying to impress someone? Because if that's your game, don't bother." Dylan's eyebrow lifted in amusement, though he didn't answer her question. Instead, he proceeded to gather the bottles and carry them to his luxury car parked just around the corner. As he loaded the water into the trunk, he couldn't help but notice Sophia's gaze following him. "Wait, you're actually taking them all?" she asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Of course," Dylan replied without missing a beat. Sophia, now intrigued, walked over to him, still unsure of what was going on. "You've got a funny way of spending your money," she remarked, though there was a hint of respect in her voice. Dylan paused and turned to face her. "It's not about the money. I just believe that your time and energy are worth more than $2 per bottle," he said, his tone earnest. "You have a way of negotiating, of standing up for yourself, and I respect that." Sophia didn't quite know how to respond. This man, This millionaire who seemed to have everything was giving her compliments in a way that didn't feel condescending. There was no hidden agenda, no ulterior motive. He was simply acknowledging her hustle, her worth. But at the same time, she was uncomfortable. No one, especially someone like him, had ever treated her with such respect before. People in her world either ignored her or took advantage of her. But Dylan? He seemed genuinely interested in her as a person, not as a means to further his own wealth or status. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice more serious now. Dylan glanced at her, a faint smile on his lips. "Because I wanted to." Sophia couldn't quite understand it. She didn't want to owe him anything, especially not a man who had everything. He wasn't like the other wealthy men she had encountered in her life. There was something different about him, but she wasn't sure what. Maybe it was his sincerity, or maybe it was the fact that he didn't treat her like an inferior. Either way, she wasn't ready to let her guard down. "Save your money," she said, shaking her head. "I don't need anyone's charity." Dylan simply shrugged and walked away, leaving her with more questions than answers. As he drove off, he couldn't help but think about her. He had met many people in his life, but none like Sophia. She was sharp, independent, and unapologetically herself. She didn't care about his money, his status, or the power he wielded. And for the first time in a long while, Dylan found himself intrigued by someone who didn't need him. Sophia, for her part, couldn't stop thinking about him either. The fact that he had shown up out of nowhere and spent a ridiculous amount of money on water just to make a point left her feeling conflicted. She didn't want to admit that she had felt a spark, that she had been affected by him in ways she didn't understand. The next day, as she prepared for another shift on the streets, she was surprised to see Dylan again. But this time, he wasn't buying water. He was standing in front of her, watching her sell. "Back again?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Here to buy more?" Dylan smiled, but this time there was something more personal in his eyes. "No, just here to watch." Sophia was silent for a moment, but then she couldn't resist asking, "Why do you keep showing up?" Dylan's smile widened. "Maybe I just like watching someone work for what they have." Sophia looked at him skeptically. "You like watching people work?" "No," Dylan said, shaking his head slightly. "I like watching people who don't need anyone's help to make it." Sophia raised an eyebrow, realizing that he wasn't just paying her a compliment. There was something deeper, something more meaningful in his words. And despite her attempts to push him away, she found herself drawn to him. But she wasn't ready to admit it not yet. Elisa and Ethan. An unexpected journey of love and growth. Elisa Martin had always believed that the corporate world was a place for people who followed the rules. She had seen her share of office drama, polished presentations, and long hours of hard work. But on her first day as an intern at Pfizer Corp, she would learn that things weren't always what they seemed. Everything started off relatively normal, but as soon as Elisa set foot in the office, she realized that she wasn't in a typical corporate environment. The building had a sleek, modern aesthetic, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the city. But inside, things weren't so polished. Elisa had been warned by her friends that working in a big city could be overwhelming, but she hadn't expected to be thrown into chaos from the start. On her very first day, she caused a bit of a disaster. Walking into the office with a tray of coffee for her new colleagues, Elisa, ever the klutz, managed to spill the entire tray onto the CEO's desk. The coffee, still steaming, spilled across a pile of papers and splashed over Ethan Pfizer's neatly arranged laptop. She gasped in horror, her heart pounding as she stood there frozen, utterly mortified. Ethan, the CEO, was known to be a ruthless businessman, and here she was already messing things up in front of him. Her hands trembled as she struggled to find something to say, but before she could utter a word, Ethan's calm and collected voice filled the room. "Elisa Martin, right?" She nodded frantically, expecting him to fire her or at least reprimand her severely. He looked at her with piercing eyes, and for a moment, it seemed like he might explode in anger. But then, to her shock, he chuckled lightly. "I guess the coffee's not the only thing that's hot around here." Elisa was stunned. What was going on? She had expected him to be furious, but instead, he was laughing. Ethan stood up from his desk, walked over to her, and offered a hand. "It's all right. Just Try not to make it a habit, all right? His unexpected reaction threw her off balance. The stern and stoic persona that everyone spoke about seemed so different from the man who stood before her now. Ethan, as it turned out, wasn't the unapproachable CEO that everyone whispered about. Beneath his businesslike demeanor, there was a side to him that Elisa couldn't quite grasp yet. As the days went by, Elisa found herself intrigued by Ethan's complex character. He was a man who lived by numbers, strategies, and profit margins. But there was something else, something unexpected that intrigued her. She watched him lead meetings with confidence, making decisions that would affect hundreds of people with nothing more than a few words. His sharp, calculated manner made him an exceptional CEO, but there was something about him that made Elisa think he might be more than just the intimidating figure everyone made him out to be. One evening, when Elisa was staying late at the office to finish her work, Ethan came by her desk. The office was mostly empty, the glow of the desk lamps casting a soft light over the rows of computers and papers. Ethan, always in control, had a particular way of walking through the office, as though everything around him was part of a well-oiled machine. But tonight, something was different. There was a slight tension in his posture, a hint of weariness in his eyes. Elisa looked up from her work, noticing him for the first time that evening. "You're still here?" she asked, surprised. Ethan smiled, though it wasn't his usual confident grin. "I had a few things to take care of," he said, his voice carrying a quiet seriousness. There was something in his tone that caught Elisa's attention. She'd seen him confident, sometimes even arrogant, in meetings and in his interactions with others. But now, in the stillness of the late night, she saw a different side of him. She was about to say something when Ethan's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Can I ask you something?" He glanced at her work, the paperwork scattered across her desk. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but why do you push yourself so hard?" Elisa was taken aback. "What do you mean?" He sat down across from her, leaning back in his chair, his gaze steady. "You're always the first one here and the last one to leave. But you're not doing it for the promotion or for the money. I can tell you're not like most people around here. So why?" For the first time, Elisa felt exposed. Ethan had seen through her, and she hadn't expected that. She thought she had been hiding her insecurities well, but it seemed he noticed something more. She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. But then, something in Ethan's calm, understanding presence made her want to be honest. "I don't know. I guess I've always had to work harder to prove myself. My family, well, they don't exactly have a lot of money, so I've had to earn everything on my own. I guess that makes me keep going, even when I feel like giving up." Ethan was quiet for a moment, taking in her words. Elisa wasn't used to being so open with anyone, especially not with someone like Ethan, who had the power to change her career with a single decision. But something about him made her feel comfortable in a way that no one else had. After a long pause, Ethan finally spoke. "I admire that," he said simply. "But you don't have to do it all on your own. You're good at what you do, Elisa, and you don't need to prove anything to me or anyone else, for that matter." Elisa didn't know how to respond. She had spent so much of her life trying to prove herself, trying to gain approval from others. Hearing Ethan say those words made something shift within her. It was as though a weight had been lifted, though she couldn't quite place why. Over the next few weeks, Elisa and Ethan's relationship began to evolve. What had started as a simple professional interaction gradually deepened into something more personal. They would often find themselves working late together, sharing quiet conversations about their lives outside the office. As Elisa learned more about Ethan, she discovered that beneath the hard exterior, he was someone who had faced challenges of his own. He wasn't just a successful CEO. He was a man who had struggled with loneliness and loss, and who had, at times, found it difficult to connect with others on a personal level. Their interactions continued to grow, with Elisa finding herself drawn to Ethan's vulnerability. She saw him in a new light, not as an untouchable millionaire, but as someone who had his own fears and insecurities, just like everyone else. She began to realize that, despite their differences, they had more in common than she had first thought. One evening, after another long day of work, Ethan turned to her and said, "I've been thinking about something." Elisa looked up, curious. "What is it?" He hesitated, then added, I think you're exactly the kind of person I need in my life. Someone who's real. Someone who's not afraid to speak their mind. And I think you might be the one who can make me better." Elisa was taken aback by his words. The CEO, the powerful businessman who ran a multi-million-dollar company, was admitting to her that she had the power to change him. It was a revelation that completely threw her off guard. She didn't know what to say at first. But deep down, she realized that Ethan wasn't the man she had initially thought he was. He wasn't just a corporate mogul. He was a man who was looking for something more. Their relationship grew stronger with each passing day. Ethan began to open up to Elisa in ways that no one else had ever seen. They went on long walks together, enjoyed quiet dinners, and even laughed at the absurdity of their own situations. For the first time, both of them felt like they were on equal footing, despite their vastly different worlds. It wasn't long before Ethan did something that no one expected. He proposed to Elisa, asking her to marry him in a simple, intimate setting. She had never imagined she would find someone like him, and yet, here she was, about to start a new chapter of her life. Elisa had once believed that love wasn't for her, that she was too caught up in the hustle of life to ever find someone who truly understood her. But Ethan showed her that love could be real, that it could grow between two people who had once been strangers, each with their own battles and dreams. And so, as Elisa and Ethan embarked on their journey together, they realized that their love was not defined by the wealth or the power they held, but by the vulnerability, the understanding, and the trust they shared. It was a love that had the power to change them both, making them better people than they had ever imagined. Ethan and Elisa, a story of love, vulnerability, and growth. Ethan Pfizer had always been a man who kept his emotions under control. The CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, he was accustomed to making tough decisions that affected the lives of countless people. He had built his empire from the ground up, using his intellect, charm, and sharp business acumen. Success and power were his driving forces, and he was used to getting what he wanted. But there was something missing. Despite all his achievements, Ethan often felt a sense of emptiness, a nagging feeling that he couldn't shake. He had never been able to connect deeply with anyone, at least not until Elisa Martin walked into his office. Elisa was the newest intern at Pfizer Corp, and she made an immediate impression on Ethan. She wasn't like the other interns or the polished professionals who came and went through the company. From the very first moment they crossed paths, Ethan noticed something different about her. She had a spark in her eyes, a determination that was rare to find in such a young intern. Her energy was contagious, and she didn't seem intimidated by the corporate world in the slightest. Her first day was nothing short of chaotic. She had barely stepped into the office when a series of unfortunate events unfolded. She tripped over a pile of files, knocking over a coffee cart in the process. The entire office stopped to watch, and Ethan, who had been in a meeting at the time, was among the first to witness her clumsy entrance. As the coffee spilled across the floor, most of the staff expected her to be embarrassed or flustered. But not Elisa. She stood up, looked around at the mess she had just caused, and cracked a smile. Ethan couldn't help but chuckle. "First day, huh?" he said, walking over to help her. He was used to seeing his employees scramble to maintain their perfect images. But here was someone who wasn't fazed by the mess, who seemed oddly comfortable with the chaos she had caused. "I guess this is what they meant when they said, starting with a bang," Elisa said, wiping her hands on her skirt. Ethan smiled at her response, impressed by her ability to take things in stride. For the rest of the day, Ethan watched Elisa with a mix of curiosity and intrigue. Despite her clumsiness, she had a natural charm about her. She didn't just blend into the background like most interns. She spoke up in meetings, asked insightful questions, and showed a level of confidence that Ethan found both refreshing and unusual. Elisa wasn't like the typical interns he was used to. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. Instead, she was just being herself, and in a world where everyone wore masks, it was a rare quality. As the days passed, Ethan began to take more notice of Elisa's behavior. She had a way of commanding attention without ever trying to. Her interactions with the team were easy and genuine. She wasn't trying to climb the corporate ladder. She simply wanted to do her job to the best of her ability. Ethan, who had always been driven by ambition and success, found himself both fascinated and perplexed by her. How could someone so young be so unaffected by the power dynamics of the corporate world? How could someone who didn't have everything handed to them still possess such a strong sense of self? It wasn't long before their paths crossed again, this time outside of the office. Ethan had just finished a late-night meeting when he spotted Elisa sitting on a bench outside the building, looking up at the city lights. She was alone, her feet propped up on the bench, lost in thought. Ethan hesitated for a moment before deciding to approach her. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, standing in front of her. Elisa looked up, surprised to see him. Ethan, despite his usual confidence, felt a flicker of uncertainty. It was rare that he approached anyone outside of work without a clear agenda, but something about Elisa made him feel different. She smiled, slightly amused by the question. "I'm just thinking about everything. About life, really. It's easy to get lost in the rush, you know?" Ethan sat down beside her, his usual poised demeanor softening slightly. "I know exactly what you mean. It's easy to forget what truly matters when you're constantly focused on the next big deal, the next contract, the next step." Elisa nodded. "Yeah, it's like you're always chasing something, but when you finally get there, it doesn't feel as fulfilling as you thought it would." Ethan was taken aback. She wasn't saying anything groundbreaking, but the simplicity of her words resonated with him. She was speaking to a truth he had ignored for so long. He had been chasing success his entire life, but now, sitting next to Elisa, he realized that he had never stopped to ask himself why. Their conversation continued into the night, and by the end of it, Ethan found himself more at ease than he had been in years. Elisa had a way of making everything seem less complicated, less driven by ego, and more about understanding what truly mattered. They parted ways that evening, but Ethan's mind kept returning to their conversation. He was starting to feel something that he hadn't felt in a long time, a genuine connection. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and Elisa's relationship evolved. What had started as professional admiration turned into something deeper. They began to share more personal moments, talking about their fears, their dreams, and the experiences that had shaped them. Elisa, despite her young age, had a wisdom about life that fascinated Ethan. She had grown up in a modest household and had worked tirelessly to get to where she was. She had never taken anything for granted, and that drive was something Ethan respected. Elisa, on the other hand, began to see Ethan in a different light. The ruthless CEO she had first encountered was just a facade, a part of him he wore to protect himself from the world. Underneath the polished exterior, she saw a man who was just as vulnerable as anyone else. He had built his empire to shield himself from the pain of his past, but in doing so, he had isolated himself from the things that truly mattered. Elisa's presence in his life, her unfiltered perspective, was starting to break down the walls he had built around himself. One evening, as they were walking through the city, Ethan turned to Elisa and said, "I think you've taught me more about myself than anyone else ever has." Elisa smiled, looking up at the lights above. "You just needed someone to remind you of what really matters." Ethan paused, considering her words. "I'm not sure I can thank you enough for that. I've spent so much time focused on success that I forgot to live. I've forgotten what it means to just be." Elisa looked at him, her expression softening. Success is important, but it's not everything. Life isn't just about what you achieve. It's about who you are and who you share it with. That night, as they sat by the river, watching the city skyline reflect in the water, Ethan realized something that he had never truly understood before. True fulfillment didn't come from wealth, power, or status. It came from the connections we made, the love we gave, and the impact we had on the world around us. And in that moment, with Elisa by his side, Ethan knew that he had found something more valuable than anything he could ever purchase: love. As their relationship grew, so did their understanding of each other. Ethan had never believed in fate, but now he couldn't help but feel that meeting Elisa had been the turning point in his life. She had brought out the best in him, challenged him to be a better man, and showed him that love was not something to be feared but something to embrace. For Elisa, Ethan was the person who made her feel seen. She had always worked hard to prove herself, but with Ethan, she didn't have to. He valued her for who she was, not for what she could do or what she had achieved. He loved her for her authenticity, her resilience, and the way she saw the world. As the days turned into weeks, their love blossomed, and they both realized that they were ready to take the next step in their journey together. Ethan, who had always been guarded, was now open to vulnerability, and Elisa, who had once feared giving up her independence, now found strength in sharing her life with someone who truly understood her. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments where they questioned if they were ready for the challenges that lay ahead. But through it all, they had each other, and together, they knew they could face whatever the future held. Ethan had learned that love was not about control. It was about partnership. And Elisa had learned that vulnerability wasn't a weakness. It was the key to true strength. Together, they were ready to build a future not based on success or status, but on love, trust, and mutual respect. And so, as they stood together, hand in hand, looking out at the world before them, they knew that they had found something rare and precious. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had found a love that would endure no matter what challenges life might throw their way. William and Isabella, a journey of resilience, love, and redemption. William Lancaster had always been a man of power and prestige. He was a millionaire CEO, known for his sharp mind and successful ventures. He had spent years climbing to the top of his business empire, and he enjoyed every moment of it. But there was always something that felt empty, something missing in his life. Despite his success, he had never been able to find true happiness, nor had he connected deeply with anyone outside of the superficial world of high society. One day, while driving through the bustling streets of New York, William noticed something that caught his attention. A young woman, sitting on the sidewalk with a cooler of bottled water, was calling out to passers-by, offering cold drinks for a mere $2. She was dressed in worn-out clothes, her hair tied up in a messy bun, and her face had the markings of a life that wasn't easy. But what stood out the most about her was her unshakable confidence. She wasn't just selling water. She was running a business, one that required determination, hustle, and resilience. As he drove past, William thought little of her, dismissing her as just another street vendor trying to make a living. But as fate would have it, he soon found himself standing in front of her, his attention drawn by her boldness and fearless attitude. He watched as she interacted with a man who had complained about the price of the water, trying to get a discount. Rather than backing down, she stood her ground and insisted that if he wasn't willing to pay the full price, he could return the water. The man, taken aback, threw a crumpled bill at her in frustration and walked away, his pride wounded. William watched, intrigued by how easily the woman had handled the situation, and a sense of respect began to grow inside him. Without thinking, he approached her, and the encounter that followed would change both of their lives in ways they never expected. She was quick to dismiss him, skeptical of his intentions. But when William offered to buy all of her bottles of water, she was hesitant. Her reaction was a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and skepticism. She didn't know whether he was trying to impress her or if he had a hidden agenda. But when he handed her a $100 bill without asking for change, she reluctantly accepted it. "You're different," she told him, her tone still guarded. William was both intrigued and challenged by her words. It was rare for him to meet someone who wasn't immediately impressed by his wealth or status. In fact, she seemed unimpressed by him altogether, which only made her more interesting in his eyes. After this encounter, William couldn't shake the feeling that something about Isabella was special. She wasn't just any street vendor. She was a woman who had the courage to stand up for herself, to assert her value in a world that often tried to devalue people like her. He couldn't understand why, but he felt drawn to her. For the first time in a long time, he was interested in someone who didn't care about his money or his position. The next day, William found himself back on that same street corner, once again seeking out Isabella. She was there, just as he had imagined, calling out to people with the same energy and enthusiasm as the day before. And again, they fell into an easy, natural conversation. William, usually reserved and calculated, found himself sharing more with her than he had ever shared with anyone else. She wasn't just a stranger on the street. She was a person who had an innate ability to make him feel seen, heard, and understood. Isabella, on the other hand, couldn't quite figure out what it was about William that made her so curious. There was something different about him, something that didn't quite fit with the polished image of the rich CEO. He wasn't like the others who had tried to impress her with their wealth. He didn't act like he was entitled to her attention. He just seemed genuinely interested in her, in who she was, and that was something she wasn't used to. As the days passed, their interactions became more frequent. William began to find excuses to stop by the street corner, always pretending to buy water, but in reality, just wanted to spend a few moments with Isabella. And Isabella, though she was still wary of his intentions, couldn't help but feel a strange sense of comfort around him. She had always prided herself on being independent, on doing things her way, without relying on anyone. But William made her feel as though it was okay to let someone in, to allow herself to be vulnerable, something she hadn't done in a long time. Their relationship continued to evolve, from casual encounters to deeper conversations. They shared their stories, their struggles, and their dreams. William learned that Isabella wasn't just a street vendor. She had big ambitions, dreams of going back to school, of building a better future for herself. She had faced hardship and loss, and she had learned to fight for what she wanted. She wasn't interested in handouts or charity, and she made that clear to him time and time again. But William, despite his initial reluctance to get too close to her, couldn't help but want to help her. He saw something in Isabella that reminded him of himself, a person who had fought hard to get where they were, a person who refused to accept defeat. But where Isabella was resilient, William had been guarded, hiding his true emotions behind the facade of success. She challenged him to look beyond his wealth, beyond his power, and to see life through a different lens. One day, after several weeks of getting to know each other, William did something that would change the course of their relationship forever. Isabella, having been struggling to pay for her college tuition, was shocked to find out that her debt had been paid off. She didn't need to look far to figure out who had done it. William had used his influence to anonymously pay her tuition, despite her repeated insistence that she didn't want or need his help. Furious, Isabella went to confront him. She marched into his office, demanding answers, feeling both betrayed and confused. She had made it clear that she didn't want his charity, that she didn't need his help to succeed. But William, calm and composed as ever, simply told her that he had done it because he believed in her. He didn't want to control her or take away her independence. He just wanted to make sure she had the chance to chase her dreams without the constant burden of financial worries. Despite her anger, Isabella couldn't deny that part of her was relieved. She had been working tirelessly, juggling multiple jobs to stay afloat, and now, thanks to William, she could focus on what truly mattered. But her pride and independence made it difficult for her to accept the help, and she wasn't ready to let her guard down. Their confrontation was tense, and for a brief moment, it seemed like they might part ways for good. But deep down, both of them knew that they had something real, something worth fighting for. And so, they continued their journey together, learning more about each other, discovering what it meant to love and to be loved, and navigating the complexities of their vastly different worlds. In the end, it was not just William's money that brought them together. It was his genuine care for Isabella, his respect for her dreams, and his willingness to support her without trying to change who she was. And for Isabella, it was her acceptance of William's love and her realization that she didn't have to face everything alone. They faced challenges, of course, especially when William's ex-fiancée Olivia resurfaced, causing drama and trying to tear them apart. But William and Isabella's bond only grew stronger. They learned to trust each other, to communicate openly, and to confront their fears together. The story of William and Isabella is one of growth, love, and redemption. It shows us that true love isn't about money or status. It's about finding someone who accepts you for who you are, flaws and all, and who is willing to stand by your side no matter what. It's a reminder that sometimes the The most unexpected encounters can change our lives in the most profound ways. As William and Isabella's story continued, they built a future together, not based on power or wealth, but on love, respect, and shared dreams. In each other, they found what they had been searching for all along. Not perfection, but a love that was real, raw, and unbreakable. And so, as they walked into their future together, they knew that no matter what challenges they faced, they would always have each other. For William, Isabella was no longer just the street vendor who had caught his eye. She was the woman who had changed his heart. And for Isabella, William was no longer just a millionaire CEO. He was the man who had proven that love, true love, could change everything. In the end, their love story was not about what they had, but about what they shared. The journey, the growth, and the understanding that love, at its core, is about two people accepting each other as they are and building something beautiful together, no matter the obstacles. The love story of Dylan and Sophia, a journey through class, pride, and true connection. Dylan Mitchell was a man who had everything: wealth, power, influence. As the CEO of a massive corporation, he commanded attention whenever he entered a room. He wore his success like a shield, and the world was his to conquer. But despite his many accomplishments, Dylan felt a strange emptiness in his life. His world was one of luxury that no longer brought him joy. He had everything money could buy, but lacked something deeper, something meaningful that no amount of money could provide. This void in Dylan's life became all the more apparent one sunny day when he was driving through the streets of New York. As he made his way through the bustling city, something on the sidewalk caught his eye. There, standing amidst the crowded street, was a young woman with a cooler full of bottled water. She was calling out to pedestrians, her voice confident and full of energy, offering ice-cold, refreshing water for just $2. At first glance, the woman, Sophia Carter, didn't appear to be anything out of the ordinary. She wore a worn-out t-shirt, faded jeans, and her hair was tied in a messy bun. Her clothes and appearance made it clear that life had not been easy for her. Yet, there was something about her that stood out to Dylan. It wasn't her looks or her attire, but her confidence. She held herself with a level of pride that most people would never expect from someone in her situation. Dylan couldn't help but be intrigued. Sophia wasn't just selling water. She was running her own small business. She had a job that required hustle, determination, and above all, resilience. She had learned early on that life wasn't going to give her anything for free. She had to work for everything she had, and even then, it was never enough. But it was in these moments of hardship that she had found strength. Dylan wasn't accustomed to seeing people like her in his world. He often encountered others who were eager to please him, people who were impressed by his wealth and status. But Sophia wasn't impressed. She didn't care about his suit, his luxury car, or the world he represented. To her, he was just another person on the street, someone who could either buy her water or move along. She wasn't about to bow down to anyone, not even him. When a man approached her to buy water, he tried to haggle, complaining about the price, suggesting that she was overcharging. But Sophia wasn't having it. She stood her ground, making it clear that if he didn't want to pay her price, he could walk away. Dylan, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, was impressed by how Sophia handled the situation. There was no hesitation, no fear in her voice. She had no time for people who wanted to take advantage of her, and Dylan admired her for it. Something about this interaction stayed with Dylan. He was used to controlling every situation, but Sophia had a power that was beyond money. She didn't care about impressing him or anyone else. She had her own agenda, her own strength. And for reasons he couldn't fully understand, Dylan wanted to get to know her. So, the next day he returned. He didn't need any more water, but he found himself walking towards her once again. This time, he didn't buy all of her water. Instead, he decided to talk to her. He didn't expect her to be thrilled to see him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important about this woman. There was something about her that was different from the rest of the people he knew, and he needed to know more. Sophia wasn't surprised to see him. In fact, she had been expecting him. She knew that people like Dylan often didn't take no for an answer, and she had already made up her mind about him. He was just another rich man trying to impress her with his money. But when he offered to buy all of her water again, this time for no reason other than his own curiosity, something shifted in her. She didn't know why, but part of her wanted to engage with him, to understand why he was so interested in her. She didn't need his help, didn't want his charity, but she couldn't deny that there was something captivating about him. He was different from the men she had known, men who only wanted to take from her or use her. Dylan, for some reason, wanted to give something back. He wasn't trying to manipulate her. He was genuinely interested in who she was. Dylan, on the other hand, was fascinated by Sophia's resilience. She wasn't just some street vendor. She was a woman who had worked tirelessly to get where she was. She had no safety net, no support system, and yet she stood there every day, facing the harsh realities of life with a defiant smile. Dylan couldn't help but admire that. For the first time in a long time, he was drawn to someone who didn't care about his status, someone who wasn't trying to win his approval. As their conversations continued, Dylan found himself spending more time with Sophia. He learned that she wasn't just a street vendor. She was a woman with dreams, aspirations, and a fierce determination to succeed. She wasn't interested in handouts or charity, and that was something Dylan respected deeply. He saw in her the same drive that had gotten him to where he was, and for the first time, he felt like he was connecting with someone on a deeper level. Sophia, however, was still hesitant. She didn't trust easily, especially not someone like Dylan. She had learned the hard way that people often had ulterior motives, and she wasn't about to let herself be taken advantage of. But there was something about him that made her second-guess her assumptions. He wasn't like the others. He didn't try to impress her with his wealth or his connections. He simply wanted to get to know her. But things weren't always so simple. Despite the growing connection between them, there were still challenges. Dylan, unable to stay away, eventually found out that Sophia was struggling to pay her tuition for college. Her bills were piling up, and despite working multiple jobs, she was still unable to make ends meet. Dylan, in his typical fashion, couldn't just stand by and watch. Without consulting her, he paid off her tuition fees, hoping to alleviate one of her burdens. Sophia, upon finding out, was furious. She had made it clear that she didn't want his help, yet Dylan had crossed that line anyway. She stormed into his office, demanding answers. Dylan, ever the businessman, explained that he had done it because he believed in her potential, not because he wanted to control her. But to Sophia, it felt like another attempt to take away her independence. She didn't need anyone to fix her problems. She wanted to fix them herself. The tension between them reached its peak when Sophia confronted Dylan, accusing him of trying to control her life. She was angry, frustrated, and deeply conflicted. Dylan, though, was calm. He had always been able to handle any situation with ease, but with Sophia, nothing was simple. He couldn't explain why he cared so much about her. It wasn't just about the money or the help. It was about something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: love. Despite the heated argument, both Dylan and Sophia knew they couldn't walk away from each other. They had something real, something that transcended their differences. But it would take time for Sophia to accept that, and even longer for Dylan to fully understand what he was feeling. Their relationship wasn't going to be easy. It would require both of them to confront their fears and insecurities and to learn how to trust each other. As the days went on, their relationship continued to grow, and so did their understanding of one another. They faced challenges, especially when Dylan's ex-fiancée, Olivia, resurfaced, causing drama and attempting to tear them apart. Olivia was jealous, manipulative, and determined to win Dylan back. But neither Dylan nor Sophia allowed Olivia to break their bond. Instead, they grew stronger. They learned to trust each other more deeply, to communicate openly, and to confront their fears together. And in the process, they discovered a love that was built on mutual respect, understanding, and the willingness to fight for each other, no matter the obstacles. Their love story became one of resilience. They faced a world that often tried to tear them apart, yet they found strength in one another. Dylan's wealth and status no longer mattered to Sophia. She had come to realize that love was not about what you had, but about who you had by your side. And for the first time, she allowed herself to embrace that love completely. For Dylan, Sophia was no longer just the street vendor who had caught his eye. She was the woman who had changed his heart. She had shown him that there was more to life than power and wealth. There was love, real and unbreakable. And in that love, he had found something worth fighting for. In the end, they both realized that love wasn't about control. It wasn't about fixing each other's problems or making each other's lives easier. It was about standing by each other's side, facing the challenges together, and learning to accept each other as they were. Through their journey, they had learned that true love wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was worth every challenge, every sacrifice. As they walked into their future together, Dylan and Sophia knew that no matter what came their way, they would always have each other. And that was enough. They had found what they had both been searching for, a love that could withstand anything. Dylan and Sophia, a story of love, pride, and unspoken bonds. Dylan Mitchell had it all: wealth, power, success, but despite his immense fortune and high status in society, there was something missing from his life. As the CEO of one of the most influential companies in New York, Dylan was admired, envied, and sought after by many. But no matter how much material wealth he accumulated, there was an emptiness that lingered in his heart, a longing for something more meaningful, something deeper. This void in Dylan's life would lead him to cross paths with Sophia Carter, a young woman with a starkly different existence. Sophia was everything Dylan was not. She was tough, resilient, independent, and had no interest in what Dylan's world could offer. She wasn't concerned with wealth or status. Her daily reality was about survival, working hard to pay her bills, fund her education, and keep moving forward one day at a time. One hot afternoon, while driving through the bustling streets of New York, Dylan's attention was drawn to a young woman standing on the sidewalk, selling bottled water. Her words rang out confidently: ice-cold, refreshing water for just $2, as she waved to passers-by. Her hair was tied up in a messy bun, and she wore a worn-out t-shirt and faded jeans. To the untrained eye, she was just another street vendor, but to Dylan, she was different. There was a sense of self-assurance in her posture, an unspoken confidence that made her stand out in a crowd. She wasn't begging for attention or trying to impress anyone. She was simply doing her job, and she was doing it well. As Dylan watched her, a man approached the stall and ordered a bottle of water. He complained about the price, suggesting that it was unfair, but Sophia wasn't intimidated. She stood her ground, telling him that if he thought it was too expensive, he could go to the store. Her response was firm, unyielding, and completely different from the subservient behavior Dylan was used to seeing from people in his world. He watched in awe as Sophia didn't flinch when a man tried to insult her, challenging him to either pay up or return the water. This bold exchange piqued Dylan's curiosity. He couldn't help but admire the young woman's confidence and ability to stand her ground in a world that often seemed to reward submission and complacency. He found himself compelled to engage with her, and before he knew it, he was walking towards her, intrigued by the fire he had just witnessed. Sophia eyed him warily as he approached. There was something about the man that was out of place. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his appearance in stark contrast to the gritty reality of the street. He looked like someone who belonged in a corporate boardroom, not standing on a sidewalk buying water from a vendor. Yet, Dylan didn't seem to mind the disconnect. Without hesitation, he pulled out a $100 bill and offered to buy every bottle of water Sophia had. He wasn't asking for a discount or a favor. He was simply making a purchase, though something about the offer seemed strange to her. Sophia, ever the skeptic, wasn't impressed by his wealth. She had learned the hard way not to trust people who wanted to buy her attention with money. "Is this some sort of social experiment?" she quipped, challenging him to explain himself. Dylan, however, wasn't playing games. He was intrigued by her ability to hold her own, something he rarely encountered. He admired her resilience and the way she operated with such confidence. Their first conversation was brief, but it left an impact on Dylan. He couldn't shake the thought of Sophia. She wasn't interested in impressing him, nor did she seem to care about his wealth or status. She wasn't after anything, just trying to get through life on her own terms. For the first time in a long while, Dylan felt drawn to someone who wasn't trying to take something from him. She wasn't after his money or his connections. She simply wanted to survive, to make it on her own. Sophia, on the other hand, was equally intrigued by Dylan. He wasn't like the other rich men she encountered. He wasn't trying to show off or buy her favor, yet there was something about him that sparked her curiosity. But she wasn't one to fall for the charms of wealthy men. She had learned to distrust people who had everything, yet still sought more. Dylan Mitchell was no exception. He was just another man who thought he could use his wealth to get what he wanted. Despite their differences, Dylan kept coming back to see Sophia. He didn't need water, but he found himself drawn to the street vendor in a way he couldn't quite explain. His visits became more frequent, and their conversations began to deepen. Dylan would ask her about her life, her dreams, her struggles. And in return, Sophia would challenge him, making him question the world he had built around himself. She didn't want his charity or his handouts, but she also didn't want to live in a world where she had to accept them. Over time, Dylan came to realize that Sophia was everything he had been looking for, though he hadn't known it until now. She had a strength that resonated with him, a resilience that mirrored his own drive to succeed. But where Dylan's success had come through calculated risks and opportunities, Sophia's success had been born from sheer grit and determination. She wasn't trying to climb the social ladder or win anyone's approval. She was simply trying to make it in a world that had given her few opportunities. As their relationship developed, Dylan began to offer Sophia help in subtle ways. He didn't push his assistance on her, but he made it clear that he wanted to support her in whatever way she would allow. Whether it was paying off her tuition fees or ensuring that her living situation was more stable, Dylan took steps to make her life easier. But every time he did so, Sophia pushed back. She didn't want charity. She didn't want to be indebted to anyone, especially not Dylan. Despite her resistance, Dylan couldn't help but continue to show up in her life. His feelings for her grew stronger with each passing day. He admired her, respected her, and he began to realize that he was falling in love with her. But Sophia, ever proud and independent, was not ready to accept Dylan's help or his affection. She feared that if she allowed herself to depend on him, she would lose the very essence of who she was. She didn't want to be controlled, and she didn't want to be a project for him to fix. The tension between them continued to build, with both Dylan and Sophia struggling to navigate the growing feelings they had for one another. Dylan, ever patient, waited for Sophia to come around, while Sophia struggled with her own fear of vulnerability. She had always relied on herself, and now she had to decide if she was willing to let someone into her life. Sophia's world was rocked when Dylan paid off her tuition without her consent. When she found out, she was furious. This wasn't the kind of relationship she wanted. She didn't want a man to step in and fix her problems. Dylan, however, explained that his actions were not about control. They were about his belief in her. He saw her potential and didn't want to see her struggle any longer. But this only pushed Sophia further away. Despite their disagreements, Dylan couldn't ignore what was growing between them. He had tried to move on, to focus on his business and his career, but Sophia lingered in his thoughts. She wasn't like any woman he had ever known, and she had touched something deep inside of him. It wasn't just about attraction or infatuation, it was something more. It was love. Eventually, Dylan made a bold move. He showed up at Sophia's usual street corner, selling water just as she always did. This time, he didn't buy all her stock, but he joined her in her work. He took on the role of a street vendor, selling water with her. In that moment, Sophia saw a side of Dylan she had never seen before, the man who was willing to meet her in her world, not as the powerful CEO, but as someone who wanted to understand her life. Their roles were reversed, and for the first time, Sophia saw Dylan as more than just a rich businessman. She saw the man who had been willing to get his hands dirty, to prove that he wasn't trying to control her or take over her life. He just wanted to be with her, to share in her world. It was this act of vulnerability that finally broke down the walls between them. Sophia, for the first time, allowed herself to open up to Dylan. She kissed him, and in that kiss, she finally accepted what had been growing between them: love. She knew, deep down, that she could no longer fight it. Dylan had shown her that love wasn't about control, but about understanding, support, and partnership. Together, they began to navigate a new chapter of their lives. It wasn't always easy. There were still obstacles to face, misunderstandings to overcome, and fears to conquer. But Dylan and Sophia had learned to face the world together, no longer as separate individuals, but as a united force. Dylan had learned that love wasn't something that could be bought or controlled. It was something that had to be earned, nurtured, and protected. And for the first time in his life, he had something real, something that no amount of money could buy. Dylan and Sophia, a journey of love, trust, and understanding. Dylan Mitchell was a man who had everything. He had the wealth, the success, the admiration of others, everything most people would think of when imagining a perfect life. As the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company in New York, Dylan was used to commanding respect in every room he entered. His dark hair was always perfectly styled, his suit tailored to perfection, and his sharp blue eyes exuded power and control. People looked up to him, not just because of his wealth, but because of his confidence and unyielding presence. But despite all his material wealth and status, Dylan felt an emptiness he couldn't quite shake off. For years, he had been working tirelessly, building his empire, but there was something missing, a sense of fulfillment, something deeper than business achievements and accolades. His life lacked connection, and he had never allowed anyone to get close enough to fill that void. Dylan's life was perfectly structured, meticulously planned, and yet he still felt like something was missing. Everything changed one hot summer afternoon when Dylan was driving through the busy streets of New York. The city was alive, buzzing with people, honking cars, and the typical hustle and bustle. But it wasn't the noise that caught Dylan's attention. As he approached a busy sidewalk, his eyes were drawn to a young woman standing in front of a cooler, selling bottled water. Her sign, "Ice-cold water for just $2, seemed simple, but her confidence and demeanor set her apart from anyone else. Her messy hair, worn-out t-shirt, and faded jeans painted a picture of struggle. Yet there was something about the way she carried herself that intrigued Dylan. She wasn't asking for pity, nor was she begging for attention. She was doing her job with purpose and pride. There was no hesitation in her voice as she called out to pedestrians, offering them water. This was Sophia Carter. She was young, independent, and determined to survive. Sophia didn't have the luxury of a rich background or a supportive network of friends and family. Instead, she relied on her resilience and work ethic to get by. Her life wasn't easy. She worked multiple jobs to pay for her tuition and cover her basic expenses. But she was proud. She wasn't looking for handouts or sympathy. She was looking for a chance to prove herself. Her hard work and unshakable confidence made her stand out in Dylan's eyes. He couldn't understand why, but he found himself compelled to walk toward her. When a man stopped in front of Sophia's stand and tried to argue about the price of her water, Dylan watched with growing interest. The man claimed that $2 was too much for a bottle of water, but Sophia didn't back down. Instead, she stood her ground, telling him that if he thought it was too expensive, he could always buy water at the store. Her defiance wasn't rude. It was confident. It was as if she had the strength to stand up to anyone, no matter who they were. Dylan was struck by her courage and strength. Most people would have apologized, lowered their price, or backed off, but not Sophia. She didn't flinch. She simply challenged him to either pay or leave. In that moment, Dylan saw something in Sophia that he didn't see in many people: courage, resilience, and an unwavering sense of self. He was used to people looking up to him, trying to gain his approval or favor, but Sophia was different. She didn't care about his money or status. To her, he was just another person, and that was exactly what Dylan needed. He was tired of people treating him differently because of his wealth. He wanted someone who saw him for who he truly was, not just as a millionaire CEO. Intrigued by her, Dylan approached Sophia and offered to buy every bottle of water she had. He placed a $100 bill on the table, telling her to keep the change. He didn't need the water. He wasn't buying it to impress her. He was buying it because he admired her boldness, her willingness to challenge someone for what she believed in. But Sophia wasn't impressed by his money. She eyed him suspiciously, questioning his motives. She didn't need anyone to buy her respect. And while Dylan was offering to help her, she wasn't looking for charity. The exchange between them was brief, but it left an impression on Dylan. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he admired her. Sophia wasn't like the women in his social circles who were always trying to impress him, looking for ways to benefit from his wealth. She wasn't asking for anything. She simply wanted to survive, and in doing so, she had developed a resilience that Dylan found both admirable and attractive. For the next few days, Dylan couldn't get Sophia out of his mind. He tried to focus on work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to her fiery spirit, her self-sufficiency, and the way she didn't back down from anyone. Dylan wasn't used to being intrigued by people, let alone a young woman selling water on the sidewalk, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye. When Dylan showed up at the same street corner a few days later, he wasn't sure what he expected, but there she was, selling water with the same energy as before. She hadn't changed. In fact, she had grown even more confident in her stance. She wasn't the least bit intimidated by the crowds or the heat. She was doing what she had to do, and she was doing it with pride. Sophia recognized Dylan immediately. She wasn't sure why he kept coming back, but his presence made her uncomfortable. She didn't need someone like him showing up to buy her water or pretend to help. She wasn't interested in his charity. She was doing fine on her own, and that was how she wanted it. But Dylan didn't want to back down. He wasn't there to play games. He was there because he wanted to know more about her. He admired her determination and wanted to understand who she was. She wasn't like anyone he had ever met, and that intrigued him. Sophia, however, wasn't interested in anything he had to offer. She was fiercely independent, and she didn't trust people who used their money to manipulate others. Dylan, though, wasn't like other rich men she had met. He wasn't trying to impress her or buy her favor. He was just trying to learn more about her, to understand why she had caught his attention in the first place. He wasn't used to people ignoring him or brushing him off, but that was exactly what Sophia did. Sophia was wary of Dylan. She wasn't looking for help, and she didn't want anyone, especially a millionaire, trying to control her life. But there was something about Dylan that kept drawing her back in. Despite her protests, she found herself thinking about him more than she would have liked to admit. For the first time in a long while, she was challenged by someone, not with power, but with understanding and care. Dylan didn't want to change her. He just wanted to be a part of her life, and that was something Sophia wasn't sure she was ready for. Over time, their relationship evolved. Dylan began helping Sophia in small ways, like paying off her tuition fees, making sure her living conditions were stable, and providing her with a sense of security that she had never known. However, every time he helped, Sophia pushed back. She didn't want to feel indebted to him. She didn't want to owe him anything. But as the days passed, Sophia began to see Dylan in a different light. He wasn't trying to control her life or buy her affection. He was simply trying to be there for her in whatever way he could. He wasn't doing it for recognition or praise. He was doing it because he cared. And over time, Sophia began to let her guard down. She realized that maybe, just maybe, Dylan wasn't like the other men she had known. He wasn't trying to take advantage of her. He was just trying to support her in the way he knew best. Their love story wasn't without challenges. Sophia still struggled with her independence, unsure of how to reconcile her pride with her growing feelings for Dylan. But Dylan never pushed her. He gave her the space she needed to figure things out, all the while showing her, through his actions, that he cared deeply for her. One day, after a long conversation and a lot of self-reflection, Sophia realized that she didn't want to fight the love she felt for Dylan anymore. She didn't need to be afraid of losing herself in him. He wasn't trying to change her, he was simply offering her a partnership. And for the first time, Sophia accepted that love wasn't about control. It was about trust, respect, and mutual support. Dylan had finally found someone who wasn't interested in his wealth or his status. Sophia had found someone who appreciated her for who she was, not for what she could offer him. Together, they had built a bond that was stronger than any obstacle that came their way. And in the end, they realized that love wasn't about what they had, it was about what they shared. Dylan and Sophia, a story of unlikely beginnings and unspoken love. Dylan Mitchell had always been the epitome of success. As a millionaire CEO of a thriving enterprise, he was used to being in control, whether it was his company, his wealth, or his image. Every step of his life had been meticulously planned and executed, ensuring that he remained at the top of the social and corporate ladder. His business dealings were flawless, his attire impeccable, and his demeanor confident and powerful. He had all the material possessions anyone could dream of, yet Dylan felt an undeniable emptiness in his life. He was surrounded by luxury, but he often found himself questioning the true meaning of his existence. Something was missing. That all changed when Dylan drove through the streets of New York one scorching summer afternoon. The hustle and bustle of the city filled the air, and as he navigated through the crowded sidewalks, something caught his attention. A young woman, standing in the heat with a cooler of bottled water, was calling out to passers-by. She was standing on the corner of the street, trying to make a sale, but it wasn't her appearance that made Dylan stop, it was the way she stood. There was something undeniably confident about her, something that set her apart from the crowd. Sophia Carter, with her worn-out t-shirt, faded jeans, and messy hair tied up in a bun, looked like she had seen the worst of life. Yet, despite her challenging circumstances, she exuded an air of resilience and strength. Her eyes, sharp and focused, showed no signs of self-pity. She was selling water, not because it was the best job she could get, but because it was the job she had chosen. For Sophia, this was not a story of desperation, but of survival and determination. As she called out, "Ice-cold water, just $2. Who wants one?" It was clear that she wasn't asking for sympathy, she was offering an opportunity, a product that could quench someone's thirst on a hot day. Dylan watched for a moment before deciding to approach. He had seen countless street vendors before, but there was something about Sophia that intrigued him. He couldn't explain it, but he felt an undeniable pull. When a man barged up to her, criticizing the price of her water, Dylan noticed that Sophia didn't flinch. Instead, she stood her ground, defending her price with a fire and confidence that Dylan admired. When a man tried to argue, Sophia was unfazed, replying with a sarcastic but strong rebuttal. "If you think $2 is too much, go buy it from the store. I've walked up and down the street carrying this cooler, standing in the sun. If you don't want to pay, spit the water back out." Dylan was amused. He had never seen anyone stand up to someone like that, especially a woman on the street. Most people, especially those in positions of power like him, were used to being in control, but Sophia was different. She wasn't interested in his wealth, and she certainly wasn't looking for his approval. She was simply doing what she had to do, and she was doing it well. Dylan couldn't help but respect her. He approached her, not sure exactly why he was doing it, but compelled to engage with her. He offered to buy every bottle of water she had, tossing a $100 bill on the table. His gesture wasn't about trying to impress her. It was more about recognizing her worth. Dylan had a habit of calculating everything in terms of value, but Sophia's value wasn't in money, it was in the fire and grit she carried. Sophia, though, wasn't interested in his charity. She eyed him suspiciously and questioned his motives. "Are you trying to impress someone?" "Because I don't need your money," she responded coolly. Dylan, undeterred, simply smiled and nodded. "No, I'm not trying to impress anyone. I just appreciate good investments, and you made a good one today." Their interaction was brief, yet it stuck with Dylan. He couldn't stop thinking about Sophia, about how she wasn't swayed by wealth or power. Her independence and strength were things he had never encountered before, and that intrigued him. Dylan realized that he was drawn to her not because of who he was, but because of who she was. He'd spent his life surrounded by people who either sought his approval or wanted something from him. But Sophia was different. She didn't need anything from him. For the next few days, Dylan couldn't shake the memory of her from his mind. He tried to focus on his work, on his business, but Sophia lingered in his thoughts. He couldn't get over how fearless she was, how she had challenged that man who tried to take advantage of her. Dylan, who was accustomed to people looking up to him, had never met someone like her before. She wasn't interested in his money or his status. She was just living her life, doing what she had to do to survive. Curiosity led Dylan back to that same street corner a few days later. He didn't know why, but he found himself watching her again, this time from a distance. She was standing there, as usual, selling water, calling out to the pedestrians, moving from one person to the next with a mixture of humor and determination. Dylan approached, blending in with the crowd, watching her work. He noticed that, despite the heat, despite the long hours, she was still smiling, still managing to make a sale. She wasn't letting anything break her spirit. Sophia, on the other hand, wasn't sure why Dylan kept showing up. She wasn't looking for charity, and she wasn't interested in his attention. Every time he came around, he seemed to act like he wanted something, but she couldn't figure out what it was. His calm demeanor, his quiet confidence had unsettled her. She wasn't used to men like him, men who had everything but still came looking for her, someone with nothing. She wasn't looking for a man who could buy her respect. She was looking for someone who could see her for who she was, not as a poor street vendor, but as a person with her own dreams and goals. One afternoon, Dylan finally decided to make his move. He wasn't there to buy more water, but he wanted to talk to her. They exchanged a few words, and when he casually invited her to dinner, Sophia was taken aback. She wasn't sure how to respond. Dylan, dressed in his immaculate suit, looked completely out of place in this small, humble street corner. But the way he looked at her seriously, without pretense, made her pause. He wasn't offering her a meal to impress her. He simply wanted to talk. She didn't know what to make of it, but she didn't trust him. Men like him didn't invite people like her to dinner. It didn't make sense. Sophia rejected his offer, not out of pride, but because she wasn't interested in what he was offering. Dylan didn't insist, but for some reason, her rejection stayed with him. He didn't understand why it bothered him so much. It wasn't the rejection itself. It was the fact that she had turned down something he thought she might want. It was the first time he had ever been in a situation where someone wasn't trying to gain something from him, and it made him realize that Sophia wasn't interested in his wealth or status. She simply wanted to be left alone, to live her life without any outside interference. Days passed, and Dylan found himself constantly thinking about her. She wasn't like the women he knew in his world. He couldn't understand her, but that was exactly why he kept coming back. He wanted to know more. He had spent his life dealing with business deals and negotiations, but nothing intrigued him more than the challenge Sophia presented. She was different from everyone else. She didn't need anything from him, and that made him want to know her more. The following day, Dylan returned to the corner, hoping to see her again. When he arrived, he didn't go there with the intention of buying more water. He simply wanted to be near her to talk to her again. Sophia noticed him immediately, but instead of brushing him off, she confronted him. She wasn't interested in his games, in his attempts to impress her. But Dylan wasn't playing games. He simply wanted to know her, to understand her. Their relationship slowly began to evolve, and even though Sophia was still fiercely independent, she couldn't deny that there was something about Dylan that made her feel differently. He wasn't like the other men in her life, those who tried to control her or take advantage of her. Dylan genuinely cared about her, and she slowly began to let him in. One of the most significant changes in their dynamic came when Dylan secretly paid off Sophia's overdue tuition. She didn't ask for help, and she certainly didn't want it. But when she found out what he had done, she was angry not because of the money, but because he had crossed a boundary she wasn't ready to let him cross. She wasn't used to accepting help, especially from someone like Dylan. She didn't want to feel like she owed him anything, but deep down, she knew that she couldn't have solved the problem on her own. Dylan didn't stop helping her. He made sure her life was easier, whether she liked it or not. But for the first time, Sophia began to see that his intentions weren't about control, they were about caring for her, in his own way. It was a slow realization, but eventually, she understood that he wasn't trying to take anything from her. He was trying to give her something, a chance to live a life where she didn't have to struggle alone. Their story wasn't an easy one. It was filled with obstacles, misunderstandings, and moments of tension. But in the end, Dylan and Sophia found a way to make their relationship work. They learned to trust each other, to communicate openly, and to let go of their fears. Dylan showed Sophia that love wasn't about controlling someone, it was about supporting them, respecting their boundaries, and letting them grow. And Sophia showed Dylan that there was more to life than wealth and success. There was love, and love was something that couldn't be bought. Through it all, their love grew stronger. They faced challenges, they argued, and they learned from each other. But in the end, they found something more valuable than all the money in the world: their love for each other. Dylan had finally found someone who didn't care about his wealth, and Sophia had found someone who loved her for who she was, not for what she could offer him. And so, in the end, they found their place in each other's lives, not because of what they had or what they could give each other, but because of the love they shared. Dylan Mitchell had always been a man accustomed to power and control. As a successful millionaire CEO, he was used to being the center of attention, surrounded by luxury, and making decisions that shaped entire industries. His life was meticulously structured, and nothing was left to chance. Every move he made, every conversation he had, was planned with precision. It was easy for Dylan to forget what it felt like to be a regular person, to live without the constant pressure of high expectations and the weight of immense wealth. But that all changed the day he encountered Sophia Carter. Sophia was a young woman selling bottled water on a busy New York street corner. Her life, by all accounts, seemed vastly different from Dylan's. She wasn't a powerful business magnate. In fact, she didn't have much at all except for her determination and strength. The way she stood there in the heat, calling out to passers-by, with her cooler full of water, caught Dylan's attention. Her appearance wasn't glamorous. She was dressed in a worn-out t-shirt and faded jeans, her hair tied up in a messy bun. But there was something about the way she held herself that intrigued him. Despite the challenging circumstances, there was an undeniable confidence in her posture and a sharpness in her eyes that Dylan found both fascinating and unfamiliar. Sophia wasn't asking for sympathy. She wasn't desperate. She was just doing what she had to do to survive. As she called out to people, trying to sell her water, it wasn't just a business transaction for her, it was a matter of survival. She didn't view herself as a victim of circumstance. Instead, she was a young woman who had learned to fight for everything she had. And in that moment, Dylan saw something in her that he hadn't seen in anyone else for a long time. Real, raw strength. Dylan watched as a man stopped in front of Sophia's water stand and criticized her prices. "This is ridiculous," the man complained. "It costs half that at the store. You're ripping people off." But what struck Dylan was Sophia's reaction. Instead of apologizing or trying to placate the man, she stood her ground and defended her price with fire in her eyes. "If you think it's too expensive," she retorted, "go buy it from a store. I've been walking up and down this street all day, carrying this cooler in the heat, trying to make a living." She wasn't afraid of confrontation. She wasn't intimidated by this man, who seemed to believe that his word was law. Dylan was impressed. He had never seen anyone speak to others with such confidence, and certainly not someone in a position like hers. The interaction left Dylan feeling something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He had spent his life in control of every situation, but Sophia had completely thrown him off balance. He didn't understand why, but he knew he had to talk to her. Maybe it was because of the way she carried herself, or maybe it was the fire in her eyes that sparked something inside him. Whatever it was, he couldn't ignore it. He approached her, not sure of what he was going to say, but determined to engage with her. He asked how much water she had, and when she told him, he offered to buy every bottle she had, tossing a $100 bill onto the table. "I'll take it all," he said, his voice calm and measured, as if this were just another business transaction. Sophia, however, wasn't interested in taking his money without understanding his motives. She raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Are you trying to impress someone?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Because if that's the case, don't bother. I already think you're weird enough." Dylan was taken aback by her directness, but also intrigued. He didn't have an answer for her, but he wasn't going to back down either. "No, I'm not trying to impress anyone," he said, his voice calm. "I just appreciate a good investment, and I think you've made a good one." Sophia didn't seem convinced, but she accepted the money anyway. Dylan picked up the water bottles and began carrying them toward his luxury car. As he walked away, he glanced back at her. "See you around, vendor," he said, giving her a small smile. The exchange left Sophia with a mix of emotions. She didn't know why Dylan had bought her water, and she certainly didn't understand why he seemed to care about her in a way that felt different from the man she was used to. She wasn't looking for a handout, and she didn't want to be treated like someone who needed saving. She had spent too much of her life fighting to make something of herself to accept anything for free. But as she stood there, watching Dylan drive away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Dylan, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about her. He was used to being in control of everything in his life, but with Sophia, he felt like he was the one who was out of control. Her independence, her strength, it intrigued him in a way that nothing else ever had. She didn't care about his wealth or his status, and that was something he wasn't used to. Most people around him sought something from him, whether it was money, approval, or influence. But Sophia wasn't interested in any of that. He tried to focus on his business, to push thoughts of her out of his mind, but every time he picked up the phone or reviewed a report, his thoughts wandered back to her. The way she stood tall, even in the face of adversity. The way she didn't back down when the man tried to insult her. Dylan couldn't understand why it bothered him so much. After all, she was just a street vendor. She didn't belong to his world, and he certainly didn't belong to hers. But despite all that, he found himself driving back to the same street corner a few days later. As he approached, he saw her there again, selling water, just as she had before. Dylan watched from the sidelines for a moment before stepping into the scene. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he had to see her again. He was drawn to her, not because of her circumstances, but because of who she was. She wasn't looking for anything from him, and that made him want to know her more. This time, when he approached, he wasn't buying water. He wasn't trying to impress her or make a deal. He just wanted to talk to her. "I came to see you again," he said, his voice calm and direct. "Not to buy your water, just to talk." Sophia eyed him warily, but this time, she didn't reject him. She was tired of being defensive, tired of pretending like she didn't care. Dylan had something different about him, something that made her pause. She didn't know what it was, but it was enough to make her curious. They spent the next few moments talking, and although the conversation wasn't anything particularly deep, it was real. Sophia had never been one to open up easily, but with Dylan, there was something about him that made her feel like she could. He didn't want to change her. He didn't want to save her. He simply wanted to know her. And for the first time in a long time, Sophia allowed herself to relax, to trust someone, even just a little. Dylan, for his part, was relieved. He had expected her to brush him off, to treat him like the others had. But instead, she was actually engaging with him. He could sense her hesitation, her wariness, but he didn't mind. He wasn't going anywhere. He was just getting started. As days passed, their encounters became more frequent. Dylan started to show up at Sophia's corner more often, not to buy water, but to talk. And over time, he began to see a different side of her, a side that was warm, intelligent, and full of dreams. She wasn't just a street vendor. She was a young woman with ambition, with goals, with a future that didn't include being dependent on anyone else. Sophia, meanwhile, found herself slowly opening up to Dylan. She was still fiercely independent, but she couldn't deny that he had shown her a different way of looking at things. He wasn't like the other men she had met. He wasn't trying to control her or take advantage of her. Dylan genuinely cared about her well-being, and over time, she started to trust him. But as much as they began to care for each other, Sophia wasn't ready to fully accept Dylan's help. She didn't want to feel indebted to him, and she didn't want to be seen as someone who needed saving. She had spent her whole life proving that she could take care of herself, and she wasn't about to let anyone, even Dylan, take that away from her. Still, as their relationship grew, it became clear that they were both in uncharted territory. For Dylan, it wasn't just about the money, the status, or the power. It was about something deeper. He had fallen for Sophia, and he wanted to prove it to her. He didn't want to change her or try to fix her. He just wanted to be with her, and he would do whatever it took to show her that. But no matter how much they cared for each other, there was always a tension between them. Dylan had a world of wealth and privilege, and Sophia had a world of struggle and independence. And despite the love they shared, Their worlds were so different that it sometimes felt impossible to reconcile them. One day, Dylan decided to show Sophia just how much he cared. He didn't do it with grand gestures or expensive gifts. Instead, he did something simple. He walked up to her water stand and started selling water right beside her. He wasn't pretending to be someone he wasn't. He was just showing her that he could live in her world, too. And in doing so, he proved that he wasn't trying to change her or control her. He just wanted to be part of her world. Sophia watched him, amazed and touched by his gesture. She realized in that moment that their love wasn't about money or status. It was about respect, understanding, and the willingness to meet each other halfway. Dylan hadn't bought her love, he had earned it. And as they worked side by side, selling water, it became clear that their relationship wasn't defined by their differences, but by the love they shared. And so, in the end, they found their way to each other. Dylan, the successful millionaire, and Sophia, the independent street vendor, came together not because of what they had, but because of what they were willing to give up for each other. In the simplest of moments, they found a love that transcended wealth and status, and they knew that their journey together had just begun. Dylan Mitchell was a powerful, wealthy man, a CEO who had everything money could buy. He owned expensive cars, luxurious apartments, and had a team of people around him to handle every aspect of his life. His world was one of meetings, contracts, and power plays. Life, to Dylan, had always been about control and success. But that all started to change the day he saw Sophia Carter. Sophia was a street vendor selling bottled water on a hot New York sidewalk. She had nothing to her name but her cooler and a few bottles of water, and yet she held herself with an unmistakable air of confidence. She wasn't the typical person Dylan encountered in his day-to-day life. She was different. Her appearance didn't reflect luxury. In fact, she was dressed in worn-out clothes, her hair tied back in a messy bun. But there was something about her that caught Dylan's eye. As he was walking through the bustling streets of New York, Dylan couldn't help but notice her shouting at pedestrians, offering them ice-cold water for just $2 a bottle. There was a fire in her voice, a tenacity that he had never encountered before. She wasn't asking for handouts or attention. She was selling something she worked hard to provide. To her, this was just another part of her daily survival. But for Dylan, it was a rare sight, something real amidst the noise of his high-powered world. Sophia wasn't just standing on the corner, selling water for the sake of it. She was really working. Dylan saw it immediately. The way she carried her cooler in the sweltering heat, the way she haggled with potential customers, and how she dealt with adversity without flinching. There was a moment when a man criticized her prices, claiming that they were too high. He was clearly a man used to getting what he wanted, but Sophia didn't flinch. Instead, she stood her ground and defended her prices with confidence. Her words were sharp, and Dylan couldn't help but be impressed. "You've already drunk half the water, and you're telling me it's too expensive? Well, if you think it's overpriced, feel free to spit it back into the bottle and return it," she snapped. Dylan noticed the way the man reacted, shocked, red-faced, and uncomfortable. The man huffed angrily, threw a crumpled bill at her, and stomped off, clearly embarrassed. It wasn't the exchange itself that captured Dylan's attention, though it was Sophia's presence. Dylan was used to people bowing down to him. He was the one in control. His wealth and position often made him the center of attention, and people were more than happy to cater to his every whim. But here, standing on the sidewalk, was a woman who didn't give a damn about his money or power. Sophia didn't care who he was. She was too busy selling her water, too focused on making her living to be intimidated by anyone, let alone a millionaire CEO. Intrigued, Dylan approached her. He couldn't quite explain why he felt the need to talk to her. There was something about her demeanor that made him want to know more. He asked her how many bottles of water she had, and she gave him a skeptical look. "All of them?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. He told her he'd buy them all, and without missing a beat, he handed her a $100 bill. Sophia, though, wasn't impressed by his wealth. She crossed her arms and gave him a sharp look. "Are you trying to impress someone, or are you just wasting your money?" she asked, her tone dismissive. Dylan smiled slightly, but didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the bottles of water and started walking toward his car. "See you around, vendor," he said, tossing a casual comment over his shoulder as he walked away. Sophia didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to men like him who could buy anything they wanted without thinking twice about it. She had dealt with men who used their wealth to control people, and she had no interest in being part of that world. But there was something different about Dylan. He didn't act like he was better than her. He didn't try to buy her with his money or force her into some kind of obligation. It was an interesting interaction that lingered in her mind, though she refused to admit it. As the days passed, Dylan couldn't stop thinking about Sophia. He had lived a life of privilege, always surrounded by luxury, and he had never met anyone like her. Most people around him either wanted something from him or were intimidated by his wealth. But Sophia wasn't afraid of him. She didn't want his money, and she didn't need his approval. She had a quiet strength, an independence that Dylan found fascinating. He couldn't get her out of his mind. So he did what anyone in his position would do. He drove back to the street corner where he had seen her. There she was again, selling water, just like before, undeterred by the heat or the lack of customers. He parked his car nearby and watched her for a few moments. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he felt the pull to go over and talk to her again. This time, Dylan didn't come to buy water. He wasn't looking for some grand gesture. He simply wanted to talk to her. "I came to see you again," he said, his tone more earnest than the last time. "Not to buy your water, just to talk." Sophia gave him a look, but this time she didn't brush him off. She didn't immediately dismiss him. Maybe it was because she had seen something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before: sincerity or maybe curiosity. She raised an eyebrow. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Dylan nodded. "I just wanted to know more about you." Sophia studied him for a moment. "Why would you want to know about me?" "I'm just a street vendor, trying to make ends meet." Dylan smiled slightly. "You're not just a street vendor. You got something I don't see in a lot of people." And for the first time, Sophia allowed herself to listen. She wasn't going to pretend that she wasn't interested in Dylan. She was. There was something about him that called to her: his confidence, his presence, the fact that he wasn't trying to control her like everyone else. For once, someone was trying to see her for who she was, not what she could offer. As the conversation continued, Sophia began to open up more. She was still wary, but she felt something in Dylan's presence that she hadn't felt with anyone else, a kind of calm reassurance. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He was just asking for her time. And for the first time in a long time, Sophia allowed herself to be seen for who she truly was. Over the next few weeks, their meetings became more frequent. Dylan would stop by her water stand whenever he could, not to buy water, but to talk. Their conversations ranged from casual exchanges about the weather to more meaningful talks about their lives. Dylan learned that Sophia wasn't just selling water. She was paying for her studies, covering bills, and trying to make something of herself despite the challenges she faced. It wasn't easy, but she had been doing it for years, and she wasn't about to stop now. Dylan began to admire her strength even more. She wasn't waiting for anyone to rescue her. She was doing it all on her own. And yet, he couldn't help but want to help her, to make her life easier in some way. But he knew better than to impose. He couldn't force his help on her. He couldn't make her accept something she didn't want. But he also knew he couldn't ignore how he felt about her. He wasn't used to feeling this way about anyone. Sophia was different. She had captured his heart, and he wasn't going to let her slip away. Eventually, Dylan made a decision. He would show Sophia how much he cared, not through grand gestures, but by meeting her on her terms. He wanted to prove that he wasn't trying to change her or control her. So, he showed up at her corner with a cooler full of water and started selling water alongside her. He wasn't trying to impress her. He just wanted to show her that he could be part of her world, too. Sophia was taken aback at first. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Dylan Mitchell, the wealthy CEO, was standing next to her, calling out to pedestrians and selling water, just like she did. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. He wasn't pretending to be someone he wasn't. He was just showing her that he respected her. That was something she hadn't experienced before. As they worked together, side by side, Sophia started to see a different side of Dylan, a side that wasn't about power or money, but about love and respect. she realized that her initial resistance to him wasn't because of who he was, but because of who she thought he wanted her to be. And in that moment, she understood that love wasn't about changing each other. It was about accepting each other, flaws and all. And for the first time, she allowed herself to love Dylan Mitchell, not because he was rich or powerful, but because he had proven, time and again, that he was worthy of her trust. And as they stood there, together on that corner, selling water, Sophia realized that she had found something much more valuable than money, a love that transcended wealth, status, and everything else. And Dylan knew that he had found his place not in the boardrooms of powerful companies, but in the simple, honest moments with the woman he loved. Dylan Mitchell was a powerful millionaire, a successful CEO with everything he could ever want. He commanded the respect of people in his world, those who were drawn to him because of his wealth, status, and influence. Dylan's life was full of luxuries, extravagant houses, expensive cars, and endless opportunities. However, one day, while driving through the busy streets of New York, Dylan noticed something that would change his perspective forever. It wasn't another business deal or meeting that caught his attention. It was a girl, a street vendor selling bottled water on a hot summer day. Sophia Carter was standing on the sidewalk, calling out to passing pedestrians in the most enthusiastic way, trying to make a sale. "Ice cold water. Just $2, she shouted, looking like she was running the best business in town. Dylan couldn't help but notice her determination. She wasn't sitting idly, waiting for someone to take pity on her. She was actively working, pushing for every sale, showing the kind of hustle that Dylan could appreciate. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and her worn-out clothes made it clear that life hadn't been easy for her. Yet, despite everything, Sophia's posture was confident, her energy infectious. It was clear she wasn't asking for handouts, she was selling something, and to her, this was survival. As Dylan parked his car and began walking down the street, he saw her engaging with a man who had just bought a bottle of water. The man complained about the price, claiming it was too high. Dylan watched as the girl held her ground with remarkable poise. "If you think it's overpriced, then spit it back into the bottle and return it," she said, pointing at the man's half-drunk bottle of water. Dylan was impressed. He had never seen anyone stand up for themselves so fiercely, especially not someone in her position. The man threw a crumpled bill at her in frustration and walked off, and Sophia calmly continued her work, unfazed by the interaction. It was this moment that truly captured Dylan's attention. There was something in her that was magnetic, something real and unapologetic that made Dylan stop in his tracks. Intrigued, Dylan approached Sophia. He asked how many bottles she had left for sale, and she eyed him suspiciously, not yet aware of who he was. "Why do you want to know?" she asked, wary of his intentions. He surprised her by saying he wanted to buy them all. In a gesture that was uncharacteristic of him, Dylan pulled out a $100 bill and placed it on the table. He told her to keep the change, but rather than expressing gratitude or even surprise, Sophia remained defensive, still skeptical of his motives. She crossed her arms and challenged him, asking if he was just trying to impress someone. Dylan smiled but didn't answer her directly. He simply grabbed the bottles of water, carried them to his car, and told her he would see her around. Sophia stood there, confused and slightly irritated, trying to figure out what to make of the interaction. She wasn't used to men like him, men who came from wealth and power, coming to her corner and treating her like a worthy person. She wasn't interested in his money or status, but something about him seemed different. Dylan had left her with more questions than answers. What did he want? Why was he so curious about her? Dylan, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about Sophia. He had been surrounded by people who only cared about what he could give them, who wanted something from him. But Sophia was different. She didn't want anything from him. She wasn't intimidated by his wealth or status. She was real, raw, independent, and unapologetic about her place in the world. Dylan had never met anyone like her. His mind kept drifting back to the way she had stood up for herself and defended her prices with confidence. He had never met anyone who could face adversity with such resilience, and it intrigued him deeply. So, a few days later, Dylan found himself back on the same street corner where he had seen her. This time, he didn't come to buy water. He just came to talk to learn more about the woman who had captured his attention. He parked his car at the corner and watched her as she interacted with customers, selling her water with the same energy and passion as before. When he approached her, she immediately crossed her arms and gave him a skeptical look. "Back again?" she asked. "I'm not here to buy all your water this time," he replied. "I just want to talk." Sophia eyed him carefully, her suspicion not entirely gone. "And why would you want to talk to me?" she asked, clearly wondering what his angle was. Dylan hesitated for a moment. "I'm just curious," he said simply. "Curious about you." Sophia raised an eyebrow, challenging him. "Curious about what exactly?" she asked. Dylan paused, trying to find the right words. He knew this wasn't a typical interaction for him, but there was something about Sophia that made him want to understand her better. "Curious about how someone like you can face the world the way you do," he said slowly. "You're different from anyone I've ever met." Sophia studied him carefully, trying to decipher his intentions. "You're a millionaire CEO," she said, eyeing him. "Why would someone like you care about me? A street vendor with nothing to offer?" Dylan smiled slightly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pause. "Because you don't want anything from me," he said. "You stand on your own, and that's something I respect." Sophia was taken aback. She wasn't used to people treating her like she mattered without trying to get something out of her. She couldn't deny that his words resonated with her. For the first time, she felt like someone truly saw her for who she was, not just as a girl trying to sell water, but as a person with her own values, her own strength. As the days passed, their interactions became more frequent. Dylan started showing up at her corner, not to buy water, but just to talk. Sometimes he would stop by on his lunch break, and they would chat about everything from the weather to more personal topics. Dylan learned that Sophia was putting herself through school, working 2 jobs to pay for her tuition and living expenses. She wasn't selling water because it was fun, it was survival. It was what kept her afloat in a city that was too big, too fast, and too unforgiving. But Dylan also learned something else about Sophia, something that intrigued him even more. She was stubborn, independent, to the point of refusing any help from others. She didn't want charity. She didn't want pity. She wanted to earn everything on her own. Dylan admired that about her, but it also frustrated him. He wanted to help her, to make her life a little easier, but he knew that she wouldn't accept anything from him. Still, he couldn't stop himself from caring. He found himself going out of his way to make sure she was okay, even if it meant doing things she wouldn't approve of. Without her knowing, he arranged for her tuition to be paid off anonymously. When he found out her boss was treating her badly, he had him fired. Little by little, Dylan was making changes in her life. Changes that he knew would help her, but that she would never accept if she knew he was involved. One day, after Sophia found out that her tuition had been paid off, she stormed into Mitchell Enterprises, furious. She didn't want his help, especially not without her permission. Dylan greeted her calmly, but she didn't hold back. "Why are you doing this to me?" she demanded. "I never asked for any of this." Dylan listened, knowing she was angry, but he couldn't help himself. "Because I care about you," he said simply. "I want to help, whether you accept it or not." Sophia stared at him, feeling conflicted. Part of her was grateful for the help, but another part of her felt like he was trying to control her life. "I don't need you to fix everything for me," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Dylan took a deep breath. "I know," he said softly, "but I can't just stand by and do nothing when I care about you." And it was in that moment that everything shifted for Sophia. She realized that Dylan wasn't trying to control her. He wasn't trying to change her. He was simply showing her that he cared in the best way he knew how. It wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that he saw her, not as someone to be saved, but as someone to be respected and loved. As the days passed, Sophia allowed herself to open up to Dylan. She stopped resisting the help he offered, not because she needed it, but because she realized that accepting love and support didn't make her weak, it made her human. She let go of her fear of depending on someone else, and in doing so, she found herself falling for Dylan in a way she hadn't expected. Finally, Dylan made a bold move to prove his love for Sophia. He took her back to the street corner where they first met, the place that had started it all. With the city lights shining behind them, Dylan knelt before her, and asked the question that would change their lives forever. "Sophia Carter, will you marry me?" Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes as she realized that the man who had once seemed so out of reach, so impossible, was now offering her a future, a life with him, on her terms. With a smile, she said yes, and in that moment, everything felt right. The love between Dylan and Sophia had withstood every challenge, every obstacle. And now, they were ready to face the world together, no longer afraid of the unknown, because they had each other. The story of Dylan and Sophia imparts several important life lessons that resonate deeply with the wisdom often accumulated through years of experience. One of the key messages is the importance of self-worth and the strength of independence. Sophia's determination to stand on her own, despite the struggle she faced, shows that true value comes from within, not from what others give you or how much wealth you may possess. She resisted charity, not because she didn't appreciate help, but because she knew her strength was in earning her way. This lesson is especially significant for those who have lived through tough times and found their own strength. It speaks to the timeless value of perseverance, hard work, and the dignity that comes from standing up for oneself. Another important message is the power of vulnerability in relationships. Dylan, a successful millionaire, could have easily used his wealth and power to control others. However, he chose to approach Sophia with honesty, respect, and care. He didn't want to change her, but simply wanted to help her in ways she could accept. His actions show that love is not about control, but about understanding and supporting each other. This lesson is crucial for older individuals who may have experienced long marriages or deep friendships. It serves as a reminder that genuine love doesn't seek to dominate, but to nurture and empower. The story also emphasizes the value of emotional connection over material wealth. Dylan's willingness to experience life through Sophia's eyes, selling water on the street, standing in the heat, and understanding her world shows that the most meaningful connections are not built on money or status, but on shared experiences and mutual respect. For those who have witnessed many changes over the years, this lesson offers an important reminder. The relationships that matter most are the ones based on understanding, compassion, and time spent together. Lastly, the narrative teaches the power of change and growth. Both Dylan and Sophia go through personal transformations. Dylan learns to step out of his world of luxury and power to understand someone who lives a very different life. Sophia, on the other hand, learns that accepting help or love doesn't mean she is losing her independence. Rather, it enhances her life and allows her to grow. For older adults, this is a poignant reminder that it's never too late to evolve and open oneself to new perspectives, whether in relationships, personal growth, or embracing the changes that life brings. Ultimately, this story teaches that love, independence, and respect are essential pillars for a fulfilling life. It's about being true to oneself, while also learning to accept and give love, and knowing that it's never too late to find meaningful connections that enrich your life. Thank you so much for watching today's story. We truly appreciate your support. Don't forget to give a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, and make sure to subscribe to StoriesTH for more heartfelt tales. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires and moves your heart. See you in the next one.